And believe it or not, he's a Singaporean doctor. A lot of people think he's Afghani because he looks like a Hazara who were from Mongolia. But he's actually in his mid-40s, and he's a very intelligent, well-educated Singaporean doctor. And about 8 years ago, he went out to work in a refugee camp on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he was working in the hospital tent in the refugee camp for a year or so. And as the refugees from the camp had started to return home to their villages, he followed some of the villagers home and travelled across Afghanistan with these people. He ended up in a rural province called Bamyan, which some of you may have heard of. It was the province that had the giant statues that were blown up, the Buddha statues that were blown up by the Taliban. And it's a very, very beautiful area of Afghanistan. It's very rural. It's probably one of the poorest areas of the country. But one of the upsides is it hasn't experienced as much combat as other areas such as Kandahar and Helmand. I think mainly because of its location. So he ended up in the rural province of Bamyan, and he was working with villagers for about 6 years. And he was researching different forms of agriculture, so helping villagers set up things like wormeries and composting and growing different forms of vegetables. Because the staple in Bamyan is potatoes. Most people just eat potatoes at every meal. So he was working with the villagers on these kind of projects. And after a while he thought, well, hey, let's start a peace program. You know, he was compelled by what he saw in Afghanistan, what the people were going through, and he wanted to do something grassroots to help the people. So he organised this peace program for 3 months at Bamyan University. And he invited the students from Bamyan University to attend the peace program. And also, some of the young people that he knew in the villages that he was staying in, they also came on the 3-month course. And after 3 months of these young people talking about peace, talking about the potential of peace in Afghanistan, the majority of people on this program thought peace in Afghanistan isn't possible. There were a handful, a dozen young people, all of which were pre-university age, who thought, well, actually, maybe peace is possible. And they went on to form the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. And since then, they moved, some of them have moved to Kabul because the situation for Hakim became unsafe in Bamyan. The secret police, the NDS, they were questioning him. He experienced things like his house being set on fire because he was getting into this whole peace program. So for his own safety, they moved to Kabul, and now he's organising this peace program, which is very cutting edge, where these young people, for half the day they learn English, and then for the other half of the day they study, you know, textbook peace ideas from Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And Kathy Kelly, she came across this group on one of their global days of listening. So one of their campaigning ideas is that anyone around the world can phone them up on the 21st of every month. And you can talk to these guys in Kabul by the power of Skype and mobile phones. So she received this email inviting her to Skype in on the 21st. And she phoned them up, and she was asking these young people, some of which 14, 15, 16 years old, about their opinions on peace. And they were coming out with these like very, very well thought out answers, quoting Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and she thought, wow, these people are phenomenal, I've got to go out and meet them. So she got on a plane, went out and met these young people in Bamyan, and since then she's taken about 7 delegations out there. Kathy Kelly, she's been a peace activist for about 30 years. She's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. She's a phenomenal woman. She's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize about 4 times now. And she was very, very active in campaigning against the war in Iraq. And before then, for 10 years, she was campaigning against economic sanctions, because this country, along with a lot of other Western countries in America, stopped trading with Iraq as a way of making Saddam Hussein cooperate with them in terms of trading oil. And so people in Iraq, they were refused things like medical supplies, children, babies weren't allowed to have incubators, children in school, didn't have access to things like pencils, paper, under these economic sanctions. So her organisation was about breaking those economic sanctions. And I think it was around about 2003, the government got around to prosecuting Voices in the Wilderness for breaking these economic sanctions. And they had to shut down their organisation organisation as a result of it, and they've sprung back up now as Voices for Creative Non-Violence. And she's continuing her work, and her focus is now in Afghanistan. So that's a little bit of background about the group I was working with. Their website is called Our Journey to Smile. It's not, if you go onto their website, it's quite bizarre. They've got lots of videos of them sort of flying kites, and they're very positive messages that they send out to the world. There isn't much political analysis, but they're very limited as what they can say publicly in Afghanistan. Because to be a peace activist is very dangerous. To publicly put your head above the parapet is a very dangerous thing. So Our Journey to Smile, it's a great website, but there's a whole lot more to them that doesn't come across on that website. And then if you want to organise speaking with these people, Global Days of Listening is when you can phone them up. And going on that website, you can book a slot. So as I mentioned, they're involved with organising a peace walk at the end of summer, which I'm coordinating groups in this country to also do peace walks in your towns and cities in solidarity with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. And I'm also trying to get groups to take part in lighting 2 million candles on the 10th of December, which is International Human Rights Day. And this is an initiative that the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers are trying to put together, and it's to remember the 2 million who have died in the last 3 decades of war. So Afghanistan, war didn't start 10 years ago when America and NATO went over in 2001. It started 30 years ago with the Soviets who went in 1979. Since then, after the Soviets left, they were then plunged into civil war with the Mujahideen. When the Mujahideen left, who were awful, mainly made up of Afghan warlords who did atrocious things to Afghan people, they then had to live under the Taliban, and as we know, the Taliban are a very oppressive regime. And then with the Taliban being overthrown, they've had 10 years now of the US in NATO, which involves things like drones, house raids, aerial bombing. So I think 2 million is a very conservative estimate. That's the number that they're going to go with, and they would like an international sort of solidarity with their campaign. So that's one of the campaigns encouraging people to take part in. So my first impressions of being in Afghanistan, it was completely mind-blowing. My first morning was the 18th of December, and I stepped out of our apartment. It's a very simple apartment that these guys stay in. They all sleep in one room on the floor, on blankets, and our apartment, it sort of looked a little bit like this. We lived above a gymnasium. And I stepped out of the apartment, and I was immediately blinded by the bright light. Afghanistan is these very typical, very bright blue skies. You never have a cloudy day. The sun is always very, very bright, so it's intensely bright when you step out of the house. And once I sort of got over the whole thing of the brightness, I was then immediately choked by the pollution. Kabul is one of the most polluted cities in the world. It's located in a basin, so it's surrounded by lots of mountains, and that means that the pollution that's generated in the city doesn't leave because it's in this bowl. And it has lots of cars. There's a factory, an American factory on the edge of the city, which burns military equipment, old military equipment. And so all that pollution is also being churned into the city, along with all the cars and the pollution. So a lot of guys, they're wearing masks across their face, not for like fundamentalist reasons, but because it's really hard to breathe. And I ended up, having a scarf across my face, not for religious reasons, but because it's so hard to breathe. And then the next thing that immediately struck me was just how non-existent basic infrastructure is. So here you can see a load of rubbish. This doesn't fairly represent how bad the situation is. You can walk down the street and there's just piles of rubbish, and there are people picking through rubbish, looking for bits of junk. People very entrepreneurial in Kabul. You set up a shop on the side of the road with a cardboard box selling bits of junk. You see that all the time. But basic infrastructure like rubbish collection just isn't taking place. We will put our rubbish out, it disappeared, but I don't know where it went because there was just piles of rubbish everywhere. And then the other thing that hit me was the sewage system. You can sort of see here, you would have this system of open ditches. So you'd be walking along a pavement, and there are have loads of rubbish, but again, I think there's a lot of untreated sewage that's placed into these ditches. And so a lot of the time when you're walking down the street, there's this strong smell of sulphur that's quite overpowering. So it's phenomenal to think that after 10 years of occupation by NATO, by America, at this point I tell you that America has spent $500 billion in the war in Afghanistan. In this country we spent £18 billion in the war in Afghanistan, and yet still basic infrastructure such as rubbish disposal, supply of clean drinking water, sewage disposal just hasn't been put in place in their capital city. 40% of the funds that actually go, there was one research paper by an NGO that said 40% of funds that have been placed into Afghanistan, that people don't actually see, it doesn't actually get to a ground level, it's absorbed by corruption, by NGOs, Western NGOs, and in fact Kabul is crawling with Westerners, but you don't see them when you're walking the street because they're all in these very heavily secured compounds, and there's like this kind of bubble that exists within certain areas of Kabul where Westerners go and shop, where Westerners go and eat, and they have, you know, you get driven from your secured compound into your work, and these people are working in NGOs and they're very highly paid. One person that I came across who was an American woman, she was getting paid up to $1,000 a month, and all her expenses paid for working for a media NGO in Kabul. So those are the money that is poured into the country is not actually seen by the Afghans. There's 40% unemployment, however the National Union of Workers say it's more like 70%. And the Human Development Index in 2011 said that Afghanistan is 172 out of 187 poorest countries in the world. So it's a typical third world developing country, but on top of it, it's just a very broken country. It's had 3 decades of war. I was mentioning in the interview beforehand, when you walk down the road, you can just sense, you know, the pain that people have gone through. You look into people's eyes. The number of people who had disabilities is phenomenal, who have who've lost limbs, who are walking with limps, who have got crutches, who have lost their eyes, who have got scars on their faces. It's just phenomenal. You walk down the street and it's very commonplace to see a nation of broken people and lots of people with mental health difficulties. One person I spoke to out there who was a doctor said that he thought 80% of people in Afghanistan had some sort of mental health difficulty because of the 3 decades of war. Just to mention very briefly, drugs, the problem with drugs is a recent phenomenon that's sprung up in the last 10 years since the occupation. Under the Taliban, horrible, oppressive, fundamentalist regime, but they did more or less eradicate the production of opium. Now, in the last 10 years, opium production has gone through the roof. 80% of the opium that you find on the streets in this country comes from Afghanistan. 65% of that is processed into heroin even before it leaves the country. So you've got a massive production of opium and also the growing of it. And there's drone airplanes in the sky all the time. They've got cameras on them. The American government knows this is happening, and I'm not going to go into the world of conspiracy, but I would very strongly suspect they are actually facilitating that. And certainly when I've spoken to soldiers who have now gone, British soldiers who are now peace activists, they say that they were sent on certain missions to close down farmers who were growing opium, but on the occasions that they were sent to these farms, it was because these farmers weren't cooperating at the price that drugs barons wanted to buy their drugs at. And just to give you an idea, Karzai, who's the president of Afghanistan, his brother, who was assassinated a few months ago, he was one of the country's leading drug barons. So it's endemic within the government, it's endemic within the whole structure of Afghanistan, that people at the top are profiting and they know what is going on. So my personal experience, I've been campaigning against the war in Afghanistan for more or less since it began. I wasn't very active in the early sort of 2000s, but then I think over the last 5 years I have been very active with campaigning against the war in Afghanistan. And one of the main things that I have been involved with has been prosecuting the government for war crimes in Afghanistan. And in April 2010, I was lucky enough to take my case to the High Court thanks to public interest lawyers who, some of you may have heard about them. Phil Shiner, he's the leader of the practice, and they took a case called the Baha Musa case to the High Court, and that was about an Iraqi British soldiers. And we took this case to court, and what was basically happening was Britain had signed a memorandum of understanding. It's called the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the Afghan government, which basically said that if they captured any Afghans, within 96 hours, they suspected them of being insurgents, they would hand them over to the Afghan authorities. And the Afghan authorities, the NDS, who are the secret police, were then torturing those people with electric shocks, with beatings, sleep deprivation, stress positions. And these people were tortured for confessions, to say they were part of insurgents, they were Taliban, whatever. And then they were then sent to court and convicted on the basis of these confessions gained through torture. And Britain, under international law, you're supposed to, if you capture someone in a warfare situation, it's your legal obligation to look after them. So by handing them over to authority, which has an awful track record in torture, that everybody knows about, it's been endemic since the Soviets in '79, by handing them over to an authority, there's awful track record, they're in breach of international law, the Geneva Convention. So on that basis, we went to the High Court, and we had testimonies from a number of prisoners who complained of being tortured. You know, I never knew their names, I never met them. One of the prisoners apparently disappeared halfway through the case. And the case went on for 2 weeks, and it's just so far removed. You know, you read on the paper about what was happening in Afghanistan. The High Court is such a far removed place. It's just a bunch of very upper class white men in these wigs and robes prancing around, and you just think you've never lived a normal day's life, daily, and you're making decisions about people in Afghanistan anyway. When I got to see the documents and the information about Afghan detainees, on a lot of occasions the information was redacted, it was blacked out. So it would start off with a sentence, prisoner A complained of being tortured, he said, and then whole big blocks just redacted, just blacked out, and you turn over and it would say, the worrying story continued, and yet more information blacked out. So it was a case whereby a lot of the information I didn't even get to see, and I was the person bringing the case. After 2 weeks, the judges went away and they thought about all the information that had been presented to them, loads of human rights records, testimonies from Afghans, emails that had been released by the MOD that they didn't want to be released, admitting that they knew about torture for a very long time. And they came back and said, it's really worrying what's happening in Afghanistan and Britain's involvement. And they recommended that Britain stop transferring to Kandahar and Polisharki prison. They could continue to transfer to Kandahar and Polisharki, but not to Kabul. And they also said that there should be better monitoring of those people when they were transferred, and that was it. So in the papers it was reported as a partial victory in that, they were saying that changes needed to take place, so they were obviously acknowledging that there was bad stuff going on, but they didn't slam the government, didn't lampoon the government, say this is outrageous, you've involved us in war crimes in Afghanistan, which is basically, that was the outcome I was looking for. In Canada, the same thing was happening about a year ahead of us, whereby Canada had also been doing the same thing of capturing Afghans, handing them over, and they were then being tortured. But for Canada at the time, they had a coalition government, and there was this discrepancy about when the government said they knew this was happening and when they actually did know it was happening. So the Canadian media were very interested in our case. And there's some jaw-dropping statements on YouTube, if you want to go and look at YouTube, of Canadian officials who are basically admitting to atrocities that happen in Afghanistan that Canada has been involved with. And this is one of them, Richard Colvin, who was the former second in command at Canada's embassy in Kabul. He said, "As I learned more about our detainee practices, I came to a conclusion they were contrary to Canada's values, contrary to Canada's interests, contrary to Canada's official policy, and also contrary to international law. The likelihood is that all the Afghans we handed over were tortured. We detained and handed over for severe torture a lot of innocent people." And his statement goes on that basically a lot of these people, they were farmers, they were in a field, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think in a lot of cases, these Afghans, they are basically in the wrong place at the wrong time and have been caught up in horrible things. Since then, UNIMA, they they brought out a report last year in October 2011, and they interviewed 379 people randomly in prisons across Kabul, and they found that of these detainees, 46% of the people interviewed had been tortured during interrogation. So they had been tortured in order to gain confessions of them. So it's still happening. And of that 46%, 89% of the interviewees had been transferred to Afghan custody by NATO. So UK is part of NATO, so it's still continuing. On the basis of this report, the High Court, public interest lawyers and I have relaunched our case about British complicity, and we had a hearing about a month ago, and we're teaming up with another business called Lead A, and Lead A have actually managed to find an Afghan prisoner who had been transferred by British military. And his story, Saeed Mohammed, is completely shocking. He was found running away from a bunch of, grenades, a bunch of rocket grenades in Kandahar by the British military, and he was taken back to these grenades, and he was handcuffed, and he was photographed by British military. And then he was then handed over to the NDS with this photograph of him, the staged photograph, standing of him in front of the grenades with his handcuffs on, and he was then interrogated by the secret police with this photograph in his face saying, "We know that you're Taliban, admit it." And whether he was a Talib or not, that's another case. And when it came up in the hearing, this has happened to this gentleman, Saeed Mohammed, the judge was just outraged. He was saying, if that had happened in this country, where there was staged evidence that was used as a justification, as a prompt for torturing something, there would just be a national outcry. And the government's defence lawyers, I think it was a slip of the tongue, he does answer back, but it's not in this country. And we were all just sort of sitting there going, oh my God, how can you say that? But I think that is the mentality, I think, of a lot of people in power today, and a lot of people, who are defending the government. It's not happening in our country, so it's okay, even though we're responsible for it. So what else can I say about that? Let's see. Okay, so also in regards to torture and detention in Afghanistan, there's the prison Bagram, which is an American prison. So America, you may have heard of Guantanamo. America's got into putting their prisons in other countries so they don't have to abide by their own laws. So they've got this prison called Bagram, and it's sort of outside Kabul. I drove past the road that went to Bagram. I don't know, I think it takes about a day to drive there. And so it's an American prison. A British resident, Bashir al-Rawi, he was held in Bagram illegally before going to Guantanamo Bay, and he actually describes Guantanamo Bay as a holiday camp compared to Bagram. And inmates have complained of being beaten, let's see now, electric shock, sexual humiliation, sleep deprivation. There's been over 4,000 people who have been held in Bagram, and at the moment there's 757 people still there. You may have heard in 2002, 2 Afghan detainees, they were tortured to death in Bagram by American soldiers with their arms, they were suspended from the ceiling with their arms in the air, and they were beaten to death by American soldiers. And there's been reports in the media about American soldiers beating up Afghans as revenge for 9/11. So it's outrageous. Probably some of the most appalling human rights abuses are happening in Afghanistan, and it's happening by the Americans, and it's happening with British complicity. So this is one of the Afghan Youth Peace volunteers. This is Raz Mohammed, and he is. Oh, I should just explain a little bit of background about Afghanistan. So Afghanistan it's very ethnically diverse. So you have here Raz Mohammed, who's a Pashtun, and the majority of people in Afghanistan are Pashtuns. I think it's around 80%. And Hamid Karzai, who's the president, he's a Pashtun. The Taliban, they're Pashtuns. They're sort of mainly located on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So they have a lot of influence in the country. They're quite well respected. They've got quite a lot of money, but then also the Taliban as well. So a lot of people, there's a lot of sort of mistrust or hatred towards them also. Faiz here, he's 22 and he's studying to be a journalist. He's a Tajik. And they're one of the minorities, I think about 10% of the Tajiks. And they're sort of considered, okay, in terms of people who have sort of then these two boys who are both 16, Ali and Abdullah, they're Hazara, and they're the ethnic group who are looked down upon the most. They're kind of descended from Genghis Khan. They're Mongols. So they, Genghis Khan, he stormed into Afghanistan in, I think, the 10th century and massacred loads of people, and the country, some people say the country's still trying to recover from that. And lots of people look down on the Hazara. They're labelled as criminals. I've heard people say you can trust all the other groups, but you can't trust the Hazara. So one of the unique things about the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers is that it's made up of these different groups. Some of them are Shia, and some of them are what's the other? Sunni. So, and they actually pray together as well, which is really unusual, because in Afghanistan you have the two separate mosques. You have Shia and Sunni mosques, and there were a couple of weeks before I went out there was the bombing of a Shia mosque not far from where we were staying. I think over 100 Shia Muslims were killed, and that was by Sunni Muslims. So it's very unique that this group is together and they're working with their differences. So aerial bombing. So this is the picture taken by a British photojournalist called Guy Smallman, who I've met a few times, and I even met him when I was out in Afghanistan. And this is in a village in the Farah province, Granai in the Farah province, which is kind of to the west of Afghanistan. And he was in Afghanistan at the time, and he saw on the news about this bombing, this aerial bombing that had taken place by the Americans. And he took a massive risk, and he managed to find a translator, and they went out to this village. And what had basically happened was there had been fighting between the Taliban and the Afghan army. And the fighting had gone on for 3 or 4 days, very fierce fighting in this village. So the Afghan army had called up the Americans and said, come and help us out. And the Americans had come in. The ground forces, they were still not controlling the Taliban. So they called up the aerial support who flew over from the Gulf. And the villagers, they were aware that this fighting had been taking place. And they thought the most sensible thing to do was to refuge in their mosque, because it was, it's a civilian building. It's on the grid references as a civilian building. So all the villagers, they all piled into the mosque, and the aeroplane flew over, and again, using their heat sensors, detected a mass of people in this building and dropped a bomb on the mosque in the middle of the night. And I can't imagine what it was like. In the mayhem, people decided, okay, the best thing for us, the remaining people to do, was to go to the north of the village, where there was a shelter, and it would be even further away, hopefully, from the fighting. So the people who were still alive left the mosque and travelled to the north of the village, and the plane flew back over and dropped another bomb on those people. So when Guy Smallman arrived, he found that there were 70 fresh graves that had been dug, and a massive grave between 40 and 50 metres across containing 50 remains of people's bodies. And Guy Smallman, he's the only journalist who's spoken about this. It's not in the mainstream media. You don't really hear about this kind of thing happening in this country. Aerial bombing is something that's happening all the time. A couple of weeks before I actually went out there was a case of some children who were bombed in fields. They were children from a rural province in Kandahar. They were farming children. If you're born in the rural province as a Afghani, you're going to be a farmer child. And the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, because they're all from very rural backgrounds, they're very working class people, they felt an affinity with these young children. I think there were 6 children between the ages of 6 and 12 who were killed in this aerial bombing. And so the Afghan Youth Volunteers, they had a candlelight vigil for them a couple of weeks before I got there. The Senlist Council in 2006 were actually a pro-war organisation. They released a figure in 2006 saying between 2,000 and 3,000 civilians may have been killed in aerial bombings in South Afghanistan alone. It's very hard to collate numbers to find out exactly how many people were being killed. Things like birth records don't exist in Afghanistan. People don't have dates of birth or anything like that. So it's very hard to find out exactly how many people are being killed. House raids are another thing that this government is involved with. This is a gentleman called Saeed Mohammed who was living in Kabul. In 2008, the Afghan army, along with American Special Forces, burst into his home, accused him of being an insurgent, dragged him away. He was released the next day, and he returned home to find that his son had been killed, his son's wife had been killed, and their 2 children, who were aged 1 and 2, had also been killed. I think this is, again, quite a typical story. Between May 2010 and February 2011, NATO sources say that 2,599 people were killed in 6,282 house raids. There's been a fair bit of media coverage about, especially about night raids, people in the middle of the night, the military, British military, American military bursting into Afghan people's homes, dragging them off or shooting them. The military defend it as like targeted killing, but there are, you know, lots of different examples of civilians, innocent civilians who've been caught in the crossfire. So this Afghan youth volunteer I mentioned earlier is Abdullah. He's a Hazara, and he's 16 years old, and his English was very, very good. He had the best English out of all of them, so I would talk to him a lot. And again, he was very poetic and very heartfelt and very, very, very sweet young man. And he was telling me when he was 5, his village came under attack by the Taliban. And the villagers all decided, okay, the best thing for us to do is to evacuate our village and go to a refugee camp. So his family made a plan that his dad would flee in one direction, his mum and he and his 2 brothers with some other villagers would flee in another direction. And over 2 weeks, his older brother, who was 15, carried him on his back across the mountains. And there were, he has this description of this crazy scene of mass exodus of hundreds of people walking across these mountains for weeks, and people would be falling down into the ravines, and there was such panic to get out of the area that nobody could stop to help people who had fallen down. And after these 2 weeks of panic and mass exodus, they got to the refugee camp, and a few months later they heard that his father had been captured by the Taliban and murdered. So again, I think this is a typical story of an Afghan who has been affected by the Taliban. I usually mention that I think the Taliban today are very different to what they were 10 years ago when they were in control of the country. They, as we know, they were very Islamic fundamentalist organisation. They had a very severe interpretation of Sharia law, an interpretation that I think the majority of Muslims around the world would not agree with. And I think today a lot of the people who are joining the Taliban are actually in it to join the resistance movement, because there isn't a lot of resistance in Afghanistan. You know, you've got the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers, but there are a dozen people. And certainly one of the only studies to find out if this is true, in 2007, a survey commissioned by Canada's Globe and Mail newspaper reported the typical Taliban foot soldier battling Canadian troops and their allies in Kandahar is not a global jihadist who dreams of someday waging war on Canadian soil. He knows or loves someone killed by a bomb dropped from the sky and firmly believes that expelling the foreigners will set things right with his troubled land. And this newspaper in Canada, they did a questionnaire of 47 Taliban soldiers, which, you know, it's not that many, is it, 47, but again, it's one of the few indications we have of what people in the Taliban think. And they found that a third of respondents claimed that at least one family member had died in aerial bombing in the recent years, and that many described fighting to defend Afghan villages from airstrikes by foreign troops. So that's the situation with the Taliban. So I think they have changed a lot. My impression was that the majority of Afghan people who I came across had a massive fear of the Taliban, had a fear of the Taliban coming back in. They were a very oppressive regime. The majority of people don't want to see the Taliban back in the government today. But at the same time, you do have people signing up for the Taliban, but I think mainly today because it's seen as a resistance movement, rather than, you know, people are joining because they have a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. Okay. I'll just talk briefly about this group. So these 2 women I met, Ria and Bida, amazing, phenomenal women. You know, you hear about how women are oppressed in Afghanistan, and, you know, certainly they are really oppressed in Afghanistan. But these are examples of 2 women who are managing to play the system. And they formed a group called the Social Association of Afghan Justice Seekers. I'm sure it's got a more catchier name in Dari, but that's what it translates into. And they met during university, and they had a university lecturer who inspired them with stories of past heroes in Afghanistan who stood up for human rights, who stood up for Afghans, and were trying to stop corruption and the murder of innocent Afghans by the Mujahideen and the Taliban. And they were really inspired by their tutors, their lecturers' stories of the past heroes. So they thought after university they wanted to go on and do a similar thing. So they set up this organisation, and they travel around to various provinces, and they organise rooms for people to come to who have lost family, friends to the war in Afghanistan. And people come to these rooms and they talk about their loved ones who they've lost. And they're also very keen on collecting names, trying to create a database of people who have been killed, people who have been sent to prisons and then disappeared. That's very commonplace, that you get sent to a prison in Afghanistan and nobody ever hears of you again. And they also organise demonstrations. So this protest was in Kabul, and the majority of people who came to it were women, and I think there were some teenage boys who were there as well. As a result of their work, they regularly receive death threats from the government. They have to be very careful about what they say, and what people who interview them, what they say about them as well. And on various occasions when they've gone into rural provinces, villagers are told by the warlords that if you speak to these people, will come and will either beat you up or will kill you. So this is the kind of thing that they're working under. The situation in Afghanistan nationally is very similar to the feudal system, whereby you have a warlord who's in control of an area, and they control the land, they control the crops, and you're very much, you're very under the hand of that warlord. So when you have things like elections, you receive a lot of pressure from the warlord to vote in a certain way, to vote for them, to vote for your ethnic group. And ethnic division is very much played upon, especially in elections, and allowing warlords to continue their reign, their grip on people, because you spread propaganda like, oh, if you vote for such and such who is a Hazara, the Hazara will get in, and we all know what the Hazara will do. You need to vote for me because I'm a Tajik and we're all Tajiks together. So that's the situation in Afghanistan, and these people who are in control, these warlords, have been put into control, have been put into the government by America and NATO, this country. So the situation for the government in Afghanistan is that the majority of people who are in the government are made up of warlords who have been involved in past atrocities over the decades. In 2010, the Christian Science Monitor reported a new generation of Afghan warlords have risen since 2001 and attained wealth and power through NATO security contracts and lucrative construction deals. So a lot of the aid, or a lot of the construction deals, build water wells, build schools, are given to these warlords, and they're pocketing it and building these big fancy houses. And on the edge of Kabul, I came across these amazing mansions that had walls and armed security guards around it, and these are the people who are profiting from the war in Afghanistan. There's the example of the 2009 presidential election, where Karzai selected an individual called Mohammed Qazim Fahim to be his right-hand man. Human Rights Watch describes this individual as one of the most notorious warlords in the country, with the blood of many Afghans on his hands from the civil war. They identify him as a key commander in the February 1993 Ashbishar massacre, where about 800 members of the Shia Hazara minority were killed in Kabul. So, the President Karzai, he's hanging out with all these people who've got well known for having blood on their hands. So we saw some of the pictures before we started. They were rotating, and they were of a refugee camp that I went to visit in Kabul. And it's phenomenal. Homelessness is not something that's very common in Kabul. In Afghanistan, it's sort of like when people become homeless, they are taken in by their family or by neighbours. When children are orphaned, you get taken in by, you don't have social services, you get taken in by your neighbour. But when people were massively displaced, all that kind of infrastructure breaks down. And so in Kabul, you would just come across refugee camps all the time. It was a city built for 500,000 people, and it's now housing 4 million. And a lot of those people are refugees. So when I went to the refugee camp, I went with somebody from Peace News who had taken some money over to buy very vital supplies. It was the month of January, which is the coldest month in Afghanistan, and it was roughly £2,000. They bought They brought sugar, flour, oil and wood to this refugee camp. And the refugee camp that I went to, it housed 300 families, and on average there's about 9 people per family. And this convoy of aid fed the refugee camp for a month. And so when I arrived, there was this very euphoric mood in the air that they had received some aid. And I was introduced as, like, you know, representative for Peace News. So I think a lot of people thought that I had personally given the money, which wasn't the case. But I was greeted with a lot of hospitality. I went into one of the tents in the camp and spoke with families, and what the most vivid memory was going into this one woman's tent called Medina, and she had been widowed. And if you're widowed in Afghanistan and you're very poor, it's a very hard story, because you know, as a woman you can't go out to work. So this woman had 3 kids, she was in a refugee camp, she had no way of making money, and she invited me into her mud hut house. And I kind of looked around briefly, and there was a pile of blankets in the corner, and the mood of euphoria had kind of waned. And she turned to me, and through the translator she said, you know, look how poor I am, look, I have nothing. Go back to your country and tell people that in this country we have nothing and we need your help. And yeah, it was a horrible feeling, you know, just Western guilt. I knew that I was going back to England and I was going to be okay, and these people were still in the refugee camp. And a report came out a month later by an American, I think it was in the Washington Post, saying that children in Afghanistan in refugee camps were freezing to death. But the situation is, in Afghanistan, there's 350,000 internally displaced refugees. So the camp that I went to, these refugees were from the north, and they've been displaced because President Karzai had given their land to a warlord as a way of gaining favour, and these people were just pushed off their land and ended up wandering around Afghanistan and ended up in Kabul. Internationally, there were 3 million Afghan refugees, the most refugees in the world. In 2011, Refugees International said that Afghanistan had the most refugees in the world, reporting that airstrikes, night raids were destroying people's homes, crops and infrastructure. They traumatised civilians and displaced tens of thousands of people. And the UN HCR Commission for Refugees, they said the policy towards refugees over the last 10 years was the biggest mistake they've ever made. So there's a massive refugee problem. Okay, yeah, what about that? Okay. So, I don't know, if somebody wants to ask questions about why we're in Afghanistan and the way forward, I mean, just to give a quick outline, this is the 3rd Anglo-Afghan war that Britain has been involved with in the last couple of centuries. It's right in the middle of Asia. If you control this country, you have a good grip on the rest of Asia. I think that's one of the reasons why Britain and America's in there. I think also to sort of show military might as well. After 9/11, America didn't want to be seen as like being done over by people living in caves, so they steamed in there thinking it was going to be a quick war. And also, I think it was a stepping stone for America to go into Iraq, which was their, you know, that was what they had their eye on all along, going into Iraq, carving up the country for lucrative contracts. I think Britain just sort of went along with America, thinking that they would get a piece of the action, a piece of the you know, the prestige of invading a country, continuing colonisation, and maybe a bit of some of the natural resources or contracts that we would get out of Afghanistan. So what do Afghans want? The majority of 77% of Afghans want an end to US airstrikes, 73% want a decrease in US-led forces, 65% back peace talks. In terms of the Taliban, the majority of Afghan people think that America and the Afghan government should talk to the Taliban in order to achieve peace. 66% of British people think that the US, UK should be willing to talk to the Taliban in order to achieve peace as well. The Taliban are willing to, they were willing to negotiate, but since things like burning the Quran and urinating on graves and you know, a lot of the last few months, I think the attitude of the Taliban has changed as a result of the bad behaviour of the American troops. But I think there probably still is a potential for the Taliban to negotiate. you know, they've got their demands like wanting to run for government, but I think the situation now is very different to what it was 10 years ago when they were in control. People know how awful the Taliban are, and I think the likelihood of them gaining complete control of the country isn't that high. Although they do still have a lot of influence, I do acknowledge that. So I'm encouraging people in this country to continue pressurising the British government to withdraw from Afghanistan, being in solidarity with the Afghan Youth Peace Volunteers. I think if Britain withdrew from Afghanistan, America would be, you know, it would be very, very pushed not to go to the negotiation table with Afghanistan. So I think if Britain withdrew, it would be quite a crucial factor to America having to talk to Afghans.